Right, so we're going to continue with the lecture that was posted as part one in Suprasegmentals. A brief overview. We finished the concepts we covered in the part one, the concepts of co-articulation. We covered the concept of assimilation. We started talking about suprasegmentals. The three primary features of suprasegmentals will include intonation, stress, and duration. And then today we're going to continue talking about, so since we covered intonation in our first part, we're going to finish up with stress and duration. So, what is stress? So in order to understand stress, first we need to know what syllable is. Syllable is basically a binding of a consonant and a vowel. So ba is a syllable, ka is a syllable. So when you combine a consonant with a vowel, we get a syllable. Why is it important to understand syllable before we understand stress? Because usually syllable is a unit of stress. We place our emphasis on certain syllables in certain words, which becomes the emphasized word, and that's what is called the stress. What is stress? Stress is a varying of fundamental frequency, intensity, and the duration of the syllable. So when we change the intensity of a syllable, when we change the duration of a syllable, or when we change the frequency of a syllable that is being stressed, those indicate that we are stressing a particular syllable other than the things. So syllable, sometimes stress can also be seen in word level in a sentence. So for example, this is my book versus this is my book. So that also becomes a stress. So stress can be seen in syllable level and at word level, depending on if you're talking about what is the emphasis in a sentence. I am a speech language pathologist, right? So my emphasis was on speech rather than right? So that indicates what stress is, okay? So stress indicates which information in an utterance is important. So in order to convey information, in order to convey meaning, it's very important to see where we place the stress so we know what utterance is most important. We, lot of good examples come up to my mind because we work with a lot of our accent clients, people that come to our clinic for accent modification or accent change. Those are foreign speakers usually. We try to work on their stress because it's very difficult to place the right emphasis or the right stress in certain parts of the sentence. So for example, I'm trying to come up with a good example. We work with one of our clients where the emphasis that I'm a medical doctor. So the emphasis is on medical versus I am a medical doctor, right? So you see the difference. So placing stress becomes very important in conveying what information is important to convey. For example, the different types of stress I have written here in terms of lexical. One such example is contrastive stress, right? In order to differentiate between a noun and a verb, the stress changes between the first part of the word versus the second syllable, the first syllable stress versus the second syllable stress. So a good example will be contract and contract, right? I can say, I have a contract that is ready. I have to sign a contract to start my new job. That won't make sense. But you have to say, I have to sign a contract to take a new job, right? Or I have to say, I contracted a disease. No, that's not right. A contracted, right? So it's very important to see what the difference is in stress because it changes the meaning that is being conveyed. Okay, so the types of stress are multisyllabic stress, contrastive stress, and derivative stress. That are some of the kind of main things that you see at the lexical level. Okay, so lexical level is more so the syllable level. Alright, so some of the example let's talk about is multisyllabic stress is when there's more than one or two syllables in a word, right? And then the emphasis changes depending on the number of syllables in a word, like frequency, courageous, residual. Okay. Derivative stress is when you have a root word and then you derive from the root word to say something else. That becomes derivative stress. So the stress on economy is different from economic. So the stress is on ka on that syllable for economy versus the stress is on economic on the no for economic work. Similarly, for derivative stress, democracy versus democratic. You see how the switch happens from democracy versus democratic, the syllable stress becomes on the cr, right? And we talked about contrastive stress earlier, that is switching from the noun to the verb. If it's a noun, the emphasis, your stress is on the first syllable, while if it's a verb, the stress is on the second syllable. So, for example, permit versus permit, contract versus contract, right? So those are some of the things that you see as part of contrastive stress. It's very important because it helps us convey the meaning. And as I said, I think I mentioned in the first part of the lecture is that that was one of the main things I worked when I came here. And even now, sometimes I do miss between saying the stressing the first versus the second syllable in contrastive stress. So it's very important, and it's very important because speech is such a dynamic process, and speech is so important in conveying our emotions, conveying our intent. So it becomes very important that we follow suprasegmentals because it forms a huge part of who you are, what you want to convey, how you want to convey your emotions. Okay, so stress plays an important role in indicating which information in an utterance becomes very important. All right. So if I asked you, tell me the different types of lexical stress, the three different types are multisyllabic stress, derivative stress, and contrastive stress. If you have to give an example, you need to be able to give an example of each of this stress, lexical stress. Okay. Now, how do we identify? Of course, when we perceive certain things that says that yes, the emphasis was placed on this syllable. How do I know in an acoustical analysis where the emphasis was placed? So if you think about the emphasis of stress, when I'm stressing on a particular syllable, what are some of the things that I change? If you remember our lecture where we talked about subglottic pressure, we said that the minimum subglottic pressure required to initiate phonation is 3 to 5 centimeters of water. Then I said, as we place emphasis, in order to place emphasis on a particular syllable, we increase the subglottic pressure by 2 centimeters of water. So when we increase the subglottic pressure by 2 centimeters of water, the cue that you will see is called the greater intensity than a weakly stressed syllable. So you will see a great intensity because of the emphasis, because of the increase in the subglottic pressure by 2 centimeters of water for a stressed syllable. That is indicated on an acoustic characteristic as a greater intensity, darker striations on the spectrogram. Also, in terms of when you emphasize or stress a particular syllable, you take more time to articulate that particular stress syllable. Then that's why you see greater duration as another cue, acoustical cue. So you will see a longer duration of that stress syllable compared to a weakly stressed syllable. The third acoustic character you see is a higher frequency. The rise in subglottic pressure that we talked with a greater intensity will also assist in increasing the frequency slightly. I'm not talking about a huge change in frequency. I'm talking about a slight change in frequency that when you compare to a weakly stressed syllable. So 3 acoustic characteristics that are often associated with a heavily stressed syllable are higher frequency, greater duration, and greater intensity than a weakly stressed syllable. Okay, so what did we talk about stress so far? We talked about stress is carried in a syllable, right? So a syllable is a combination of a consonant and a vowel. Okay, stress is seen as changes in frequency, intensity, and duration of a syllable, right? Stress signals what information is important in an utterance. Okay, why is it important? Because it helps us convey meaning very well. And then the types of lexical stress include a multisyllabic stress, more than 2 syllables in one word. Derivative stress, where you're changing from one word and you're deriving another word, and then in contrastive stress. Okay, contrastive stress is important to understand the difference between a noun and a verb. And when I ask you what are the 3 acoustic characteristics of a heavily stressed syllable, it's higher frequency, greater duration, and greater intensity. The greater intensity is brought about by increase in subglottic pressure, which also assists in rising the frequency. The greater duration is brought about by taking the longer time that you take in producing that stressed syllable. Okay, so those are what makes the stress in our speech. So stress contributes a lot to our suprasegmentals of speech. The final primary feature of suprasegmentals is duration. Okay, duration is the length of time of a speech sound. How long is a speech sound being produced? Now that length of time of a speech sound is going to be varying in terms of the context in which it occurs. Okay, so it varies with the degree of stress, as we already talked about. It varies with articulation depending on where it occurs in context of that articulation. So let's talk about it for a second. Now, we already said that it takes us time. There's a lot of time involved in moving our articulators to produce a heavily stressed syllable. When we do that, there is increase in duration of that particular stressed syllable. Now, in terms of articulation, let's think about it. We already said that stops are non-continuous sounds and cannot be prolonged, right? While fricatives are long sounds that can be prolonged. So sa versus pa. You see how you can go pa. Pa is a very short transient sound versus sa versus pa, right? So it varies with articulation. Stops are shorter in duration than fricatives. Another thing that happens is the vowels are longer, okay? The vowels are longer if it occurs prior to a voiced consonant. So think about these two words for me. The vowel a is longer in the word hard versus heart. They're the same vowel sounds, okay, even though the spelling is different. Hard, heart. Tab, tap. You see how the vowel sound is shorter. It's not, let me say that a is not the sound in tap and tab, it's the a, okay? Tab, tap. So the duration is very important because it depends on the context. Duration is influenced by the context. The context could be because of a heavily stressed syllable, or the context could be because of articulation of a speech sound, the manner of articulation of a speech sound, or it could also be depending on whether when it occurs, how the vowels change in duration before a voiced versus a voiceless consonant. So it becomes a very important cue to differentiate between a voiced and a voiceless sound is depending on the length of the vowel. So it serves as a cue for us. And even if you see on a spectrogram, that's what you're going to see on a spectrogram for hard versus heart. You're going to see that the a is going to be longer in duration before the r's hard sound versus heart. Which is going to be shorter in duration. Same thing for tab versus tab. Tap and tab. Okay, that's what the increase in duration of the vowel sound is what is going to differentiate, because the thing that is different is the voiced and voiceless consonant at the end here. Okay, so if you think about this, tab versus tap, the only difference is one, there is an increase in vowel duration before the voiced consonant, and the voiced and voiceless is the change. Everything else stays the same. So duration influences how we perceive sounds. All right, I am sorry about that phone. So you're going to hear a ring and I paused the recording. So ignore that phone and just continue to go with the lecture, okay? So we were talking about duration. So duration is very important because it helps us perceive a voiced versus a voiceless sound. The vowels are going to be longer before a voiced consonant. And then it's going to help us in terms of stress. Longer the duration of a particular sound, the more stress it's going to have, okay? So that kind of sums up our suprasegmentals. So let's go over our suprasegmentals. We talked about the three primary features of suprasegmentals, which is intonation, stress, and duration. In terms of intonation, we talked about it's basically the two acoustic cues of intonation are your change in frequency, right? You're going to have a change in frequency and some change in intensity. The patterns of change could be a fall or a rise, or just a rising pattern at the end of the utterance. It will signal the type of utterance, which is what is important. Intonation signals the type of utterance, while stress emphasizes what in the utterance is going to be important, what part of the utterance is important, okay? And then we talked about how stress, the three acoustic cues are going to be your fundamental frequency, duration, and intensity, and all of it is going to be, the frequency is going to be higher, the duration is going to be greater, and your intensity is going to be greater, which signals that it's a heavily stressed syllable. In terms of duration, we talked about how it's the length of a speech sound, and the speech sound, the duration is going to be varied in terms of context. The context could be the degree of stress, the context could be with articulation, whether it's occurring before a voiced, how to identify a voiced versus a voiceless consonant, because the vowels are going to be longer in duration. Okay. The final thing that I actually would like to kind of emphasize here, which doesn't have to do with any of the suprasegmentals we've talked, is how do we understand between a voice and a voiceless sound? What are the cues that helps us identify a voice versus a voiceless sound? The first cue is going to be a voicing bar or a voice bar, which we have talked about in our consonants part when we talked about it, is that little bar at the very bottom that you can see on a spectrogram, which indicates that it's vibration of the vocal folds. So a voice bar or a voicing bar on the spectrogram will say it is a voiced sound. Similar thing that tells about a voiced voiceless cue specifically for stops is going to be VOT. Right? Voice onset time. The time between the release of the burst to the onset of vibration of the vocal folds to the next sound, that duration is going to be the voice onset time. Voiceless sounds have longer voice onset time than the voiced sounds. Now we talked about in duration, another cue is that the vowels are longer when it occurs prior to a voiced sound than a voiceless sound. Example, hard, heart, tap, tab, right? Tap, tab. Bursts, we talked about noise bursts, which is also a cue of stops. Noise bursts are longer in duration for voiceless than voiced. Okay, and voiceless is characterized by aspiration, which is a kind of a spike at the end of the release of the stop consonant. Okay, this is important because it's probably going to be on your exam question. I'm going to ask you what are some of the cues, acoustic cues, to differentiate between a voiced and a voiceless consonant. Some of the cues here are voicing, voice bar, which is seen in a voiced and not seen in a voiceless sound. VOT, which is longer for voiceless and shorter for voiced. Vowels are longer before a voiced consonant versus a voiceless consonant. And bursts are again longer in duration for voiceless consonant than voiced. And voiceless is another added cue compared to a voiced is the aspiration. Okay, so that sums up this whole part that we talked about how speech is a dynamic process. We talked about co-articulation, know the definition of co-articulation, know the definition of assimilation, how suprasegmentals play a huge role in conveying our attitudes and conveying our emotions, meaning of utterances. And the three parameters are intonation, stress, and duration. You need to know the acoustic cues for all of those. And I also want you to kind of sum and know what the cues are to differentiate a voiced versus a voiceless consonant. All right? And as I said, I apologize for that phone during the lecture. That's going to be there. Just kind of ignore that sound if you can. All right?